Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to this conference on environmental democracy. I am delighted to be here with you. I am delighted to welcome an excellent panel. It's a full plate. We do have excellent panelists here, and we will need to have them to stick to their time so that we hear and make the most, of this insightful conversation. So I am Yamit Danyat, and I am the new director of climate justice for the Open Society Foundation. It's an honor to be here, and I am going to actually kickstart and introduce, one after the other, the panelists. I will start with Dr. Arnold Quellerber. You are the Deputy Director, Law Division of the UN Environment Program. You have for many years, been a professional, provided your professional experience in the field of environmental law, diplomacy, policy, and you have joined UNEP since 2005 and advanced work on this important issue. You're going to tell us, more, on, based on your experience, through the Sustainable Development Rio +20, and all your academic work. I'm going to first ask you, one question, which is highlighting, the 2019 environmental rule of law, to give an overview on the global trends with a focus on the enforcement and mitigations approaches and opportunities that we have. Can you tell us more about this, and then also highlight the role of the international community, to advance access to environmental justice?
Thank you, Yamit, for the opportunity, and also thanks to WFD for inviting me to this important conference on environmental democracy. It's really a great pleasure for me to be here with you all. And thank you also for the questions, which I think are highly pertinent in the context of this conference. Let me try and address the first one, and perhaps give you a little bit of an overview of our environmental rule of law work in UNEP, and what the first global report on environmental rule of law, which we published in 2019, has shown. In 2013, UNEP received an exciting new mandate from the member states, and that is to develop and support the UN system, but also governments in the field of environmental rule of law. And one of the ways that UNEP tries to promote this agenda is through the publishing of a global environmental rule of law report. And as you rightly have said, the first one was published in 2019. And this report provided an overview on the global status and trends on environmental rule of law, and contributed to clarifying some key components of environmental rule of law, including, of course, laws themselves, civic engagement, rights, and justice. The report in particular elaborated on understanding justice and litigation in the framework of environmental rule of law. The report identified key elements of effective access to justice, such as legal standing, specialized knowledge, financial resources, and geographic accessibility. Key elements of effective environmental adjudications, including fair proceedings, reasoned decisions, efficient procedures, and also looked at the capacity that judges have all over the world to adjudicate in environmental matters. And I'm sure Antonio Benjamin will speak more to this. And also the report delved into the benefits of environmental adjudication, not only in environmental terms, but also in social and economic terms. While UNEP continues to receive many requests from member states to continue to support them in the adaptation, development, and enactment of environmental legislation, there is overarchingly a growing trend to assist countries in improving their ability to implement and enforce laws that are already in place. This is a big challenge that also this report identified, and that is at the core of environmental rule of law. And if these laws are not fully maximized due to the lack of capacity to implement and enforce them, then of course the environmental goals and objectives that member states have agreed to cannot be achieved. So the awareness about the role of law in achieving environmental goals and objectives is further highlighted by environmental rule of law, alongside of the legal remedies that are of course provided through legal regimes to address environmental injustices, but also to provide remedies where environmental harm has occurred. We are currently working on the second report. It's not out yet. We are working very hard on the finalization of the second Global Rule of Law report, but I thought perhaps more interesting than speaking about what the report 2019 has shown in terms of concrete findings, let me give you a little teaser of what the upcoming report that will be published later in the year will show. And these are, I think, 5 key observations that I would like to share with you today very briefly. We see an increased number of special courts and an expansion of open standing. UNEP has found an increase in the number of special courts, special benches that are particularly tasked to adjudicate in environmental matters. As of 2021, for example, over 40 countries have established a specialized environmental court, bench, or specialized judicial expertise. And over 40 states have adopted laws or procedures that provide for open standing in environmental cases. This is very important, and this is a good trend that we think needs to be encouraged. A report in 2022 cannot go without mentioning COVID. And of course, we have seen in parts of the world a regression in terms of environmental legislation and protection that environmental laws provide. But we have also seen that COVID-19 has presented the judiciary with specific challenges in adjudicating cases in general, but also particularly as far as environmental adjudication is concerned. At the same time, we have seen an increasing number of litigation, primarily in the field of climate change. And this finding coincides with another report that UNEP now regularly publishes, and this is our Global Status on Climate Litigation report. And there can be observed a rapid increase in climate-related litigation. For example, since the first report was published in 2017 until the last report of 2020, there has been a nearly doubling of cases worldwide in terms of climate litigation. This is an important trend that we in UNEP think will expand beyond climate litigation to other environmental areas. Then we see a diversification of remedies in terms of environmental adjudication. As judges get more versed with adjudicating environmental cases, the remedies that they prescribe have increased not only in numbers, but also in terms of breadth. And we can see that, for example, compensation for harm to ecosystems themselves is increasing, and symbolic compensation and declaratory judgments intended to send a message to governments, the private sector, or the public are becoming more frequent. And finally, extraterritorial jurisdiction. These are often cases that have also grasped international headlines, but in recent years we have seen that victims of environmental harms have been achieving environmental justice through transnational forums. And often this is an avenue that victims seek if nationally their access to justice is hindered. And of course, there are examples that have, as I said, grabbed the headlines from the Netherlands, but also from Canada and other places. So this is another trend. And my final point to your first question, Yamida, would be on air pollution legislation, because this is an area that we're currently looking into very closely, also in the context of our 10-year framework program on environmental law, which aims at supporting governments in bolstering their legal responses to the environmental challenges that they face. And we have found through our research on air pollution legislation that even their legislation clearly shows that it can help improve national legislation, regulation, but also the way in which or through which legislation and regulations are enforced on the ground. Perhaps I leave it there for the first question, and let me jump into the second question, which I think, if I recall correctly, was more about what can the international community do to help us advance access to environmental justice and make this really a reality for all. At the first outset, Yamini, you mentioned the SDGs. I would like to say that environmental degradation leaves no country unaffected. It also leaves, particularly those who are who are already marginalized in a much more vulnerable situation. So unless we address these inequalities, including in terms of environmental injustices, the SDGs, which of course proclaim as an overarching sort of mantra, leaving nobody behind, they will not be achieved unless we manage to address these inequalities. So what can the international community do? And of course, the international community can play a critical role worldwide in advancing access to justice in environmental matters. I would think we can do pretty much 5 key things more and better. The first one is enhancing a multi-stakeholder approach. In speaking of the role of the international community, one should not only refer to the executive branch of government, for example, but also consider, for example, parliamentarians. And I'm sure Malini will speak more to this, because they can help us ensure that laws include provisions on access to justice, and consider also through their exercise of the power of the purse, their oversight functions, that access to justice is really extended to everyone. The second point is strengthening cooperation at all levels. There is no national boundary, as we all know, for environmental harm, and environmental injustices go beyond national borders. We've observed rights holders claiming their rights at many different levels, at the national, regional, and international levels. And it is encouraging to see that access to justice in environmental matters are really taking a progressive or are promoted progressively, particularly at the regional level. If you look at the Aarhus Convention, if you look at the Escazú Agreement, these are encouraging global trends that I have no doubt will be taken up by other regions as well. Thirdly, recognizing the universal right to a healthy environment is critical in this context. As the executive director of UNEP, Inga Andersen, has commented, for example, when the Human Rights Council recognized last October the right to a clean and healthy environment. This is a historic landmark in our ongoing justice endeavors, and is a shield for individuals and communities against a plethora of risks to their health and livelihoods. But further work is needed. It cannot stop there. We need a more universal, more global recognition of this right, for example, through the General Assembly of the United Nations. And we need to make sure that at each and every level, this right is given meaning, so that everyone and everywhere can enjoy the right to live in a healthy environment. Fourth point, strengthening environmental justice by protecting environmental human rights defenders and promoting their rights. Environmental human rights defenders play a key role in protecting the environment. They're often at the forefront of pushing environmental rights, yet they face harassment, intimidation, threats, and even murder. An average of 4 environmental defenders were murdered in 2020 every week, while they were legitimately exercising their right to express their views and participate in environmental matters. This is simply unacceptable and needs to stop. In 2018, UNEP adopted an internal policy on promoting greater protection for environmental defenders, and the policy has helped guide UNEP in supporting over 100 environmental defenders across the world in exercising their rights. But that is, of course, only a drop in the ocean, and we would hope that many more organizations will join us to really give a voice to the challenges that environmental defenders continue to face. And my last point, Yamida, would be on accelerating the implementation of environmental rule of law to address injustices and promote rights. So this is where the circle, if you will, comes together. And environmental rule of law is so important because it highlights environmental sustainability by connecting it with fundamental rights and obligations. It provides a foundation for environmental rights, including the rights to access information, to participate in environmental decision-making, as well as to access justice in environmental matters. And my final point, environmental rule of law also helps us to bring environmental law out of perhaps a siloed approach that it's still suffering from in many jurisdictions by aligning it with core objectives of the rule of law, which of course are well established and are at the forefront of many legal stakeholders as they go about their important work on a daily basis. I will stop it there, and I look forward to the contributions from the other panelists and also the questions and answer session later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Harold. Now everybody understands why I kept my introduction short. You know, I wanted you to set the scene. And this is so important because we are moving from treaty design into full implementation as we're running out of time, you know, in our ability to tackle multiple crises, as you highlighted, is more important than ever. And we need those, you know, to look at things not in a siloed manner so that we avoid unintended consequences of some of the measures. And I think, you know, your point, you know, on the unclaimed heroes, you know, of, you know, to protect those environmental defenders, you know, is one example, because even in the climate space, we don't tend to necessarily, you know, highlight, you know, what, you know, or what they do and what is needed. I think the trend in terms of litigations as a power to really hold countries accountable, you know, there's not going to be a good implementation without that accountability. And it's good to see that there's more proficiency in, you know, among the professionals of law, you know, to fully embrace and to use this tool. But as you said, also we need to see more, you know, and COVID, unfortunately, you know, had a little bit of impact, but, you know, we need to be encouraged by those trends. And this is a very good segue. I don't want to take too much time, a good segue to Justice Antonio Benjamin, because you're going to bring that national, you know, experience as a Superior Court of Justice in Brazil. You're also the president of the Global Judicial Institute of the Environment. You've been appointed Justice of the National High Court of Brazil since 2006. You know, you've been a professor, you know, as well. You know, your experience in the international fora, and especially, you know, at the national, you know, side, would be, you know, is so important. And I think it would be good to hear, you know, your experiments as, you know, after Arnold, on the challenges, the opportunity on the ground. And it would be good for you, you know, for us to hear what you think the role of the judge, how it is changing to tackle those challenges and seize the opportunities that were highlighted by Arnold. That's the first questions. And of course, you know, this access to justice is very difficult, is the most, you know, challenging pillar of environmental democracy. So any, you know, insights and tips from you on how to enhance, you know, the international cooperation, you know, would be very valuable. Over to you, and thanks for being there.
Well, many thanks, Yamide. It's a great pleasure to join this panel. Of course, I think I should begin saying that if this event were organized on environmental democracy a couple of decades ago, judges would not be invited, because environmental democracy at that for decades meant basically public participation in the environmental administrative decision-making process. And also, to some extent, participation in the legislative process, something that I'm sure my colleague Malini Meri will discuss later in the program, since Malini works with parliamentarians, with legislators. So perhaps this is the first aspect to point out, that judges or the role of judges is changing, not just because we judges see new responsibilities brought to the courtroom, but also because other parts of society see judges as absolutely crucial to environmental democracy. And if I may say so, to the environmental rule of law, something that my colleague Arnold Kreihuber has already given a panorama. The question that I would like first to address, and it's in fact the first one that the organizers put to me, is on the changing role of judges. It is a changing role, but it's not entirely different from other times in history when judges were confronted with emerging legal challenge. At the turn of the century, from the 19th to the 20th century, courts in the US and especially in France were requested to decide, for example, whether an airplane could fly over one's property, or whether the owner could shoot the little airplane that was flying over. And then later on, issues of intellectual property and the environment is not something that would go entirely away from those trends. What is new is the fact that the environment arrives to the courtroom not through the traditional elements, water, wildlife, just to see, flora, to mention three of them, but the environment arrives in a holistic manner with, what do we say in law, with legal autonomy. So this holistic arrival is new, and of course judges have to adapt to this theoretical but also jurisdictional challenge. The other difficulty that we face is that courts are organized on a territorial base. We divide the territory, we call them those species of the mosaic jurisdiction, but the problem is that the environment does not respect those divisions that we in both common law and civil law countries adopt. On one side of the river, it's one jurisdiction. On the other side of the river, it's another, or might be another jurisdiction. Two different judges. This is just one example of the many difficulties that I don't have the time to analyze here. The broader question, follow-up question that the organizers posed to me has to do with judges and access to justice as a fundamental pillar of environmental democracy. And here I would echo what Arnold Kreihuber just said, that over all of us, we have an umbrella, so to speak, that we call the environmental rule of law. And this encompasses not just a state, a government, an administration that understands and protects the environment, but also parliaments and courts that do the same. So we cannot think that the environment will be adequately protected if we have one of the pillars of the rule of law working properly and the others more or less or even failing entirely. As a consequence of this understanding, it is important that we accept that judges need to be independent. And also that judges need to work through the principle of integrity. Because otherwise, the environmental rule of law will fail at the judicial level. Without independent judges and judges that do their work with integrity, the environmental rule of law will not succeed. Another requirement is that the access to justice itself be facilitated. And be facilitated not only in terms of costs, but in terms of standing to sue, who can sue, and in a number of other ways that tend to diminish the capacity of parties, especially collective parties like NGO, to fully use the judicial system for the benefit of future generations and the whole community of life. Finally, I think it's important that we move one step beyond all that. The question here is what legislation can do in order to increase not just the potential, but also the efficacy of judicial decision-making in protecting the environment. So legislators have the task to design the legal system. For example, legislators are the ones, as I'm sure Malini Mera will analyze more in depth, are the ones that will define who is a plaintiff, who has rights, who has responsibilities. Does nature have rights? So this is the next step that I think is coming to us, to judges, but we depend very much on legislators to change. Sometimes no change is really necessary in law, but it is still necessary because of strong cultural and historical perspectives that only us, human beings, can knock on the door of judges and say, protect my rights. Therefore, I think this is the next step in terms of challenge that we judges face, dealing with a system that's still not entirely embracing nature, but in this case, we do need a strong presence and action from legislators. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Justice Antonio Benjamin. It was very concrete, in supporting, this phase of implementation, acceleration. And I think, your message is clear as we see things in a more holistic manner with the challenges that it entails and the role that parliamentarians, and legislators can play to support you. But I think it was really good for the audience to understand and to understand better the role that you play as well, and how to mobilize and the forces. But it's a very good segue, for me to go to Malini Mera. You joined the Globe International Secretariat as Chief Executive, since 2014, ahead of the Paris Agreement. And I remember, an unprecedented level of mobilization of parliamentarians, when I was myself also at the World Resource Institute and, very much working with civil society influencing, shaping that, that agreement. And as we go into this implementation phase, this is also, this is equally, important. You've been an award-winning activist, and it would be really good to hear your view on what we can do, more in embracing the role of parliamentarians. What's the next step? As Justice Antonio Benjamin said, what this next step, what this level, to really foster, accelerate that implementation entails. Tell us, the trends, the challenges, and hopefully the solutions. Really good to have you. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you very much, Yamide. I don't know if I can live up to the heavy billing and offer solutions and trends, but I can certainly point to some of the challenges. And let me first of all begin by acknowledging the very wonderful role of the Westminster Foundation for Democracy in putting environmental democracy, the discussion of environmental democracy, back on the table. And by bringing together these different communities who tend to work too often in silos, those who work on environmental protection and those who work on democratic protections. So I just want to be able to offer some preambular remarks so that we can actually have a discussion amongst ourselves and also those who are participating in today's session. It would be remiss of me not to acknowledge those who have come before me. And I want to say hello and thank you to my colleague Arnold Kraalhuber with UNEP, and also to Justice Benjamin in Brazil, because we have been privileged at Globe in working with both of these giants, with UNEP and with a division on environmental law and conventions, and with the formation of the World Commission on Environmental Law, which was spearheaded by Justice Benjamin and his colleague justices around the world. And the reason that we became engaged in that dialogue at Globe, I think it must have been 5-6 years ago now, was precisely because of what Justice Benjamin has said, that in order for environmental democracy to work, you must have the three branches of government working effectively together. They don't have the same roles, but they do have to be aligned and move in the same positive direction. And this is where this dialogue and understanding of the connection between the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judiciary has been long overdue. And so a few years ago, we took some baby steps in providing a platform for engagement, dialogue, and mutual understanding between these three different constituencies. That journey is not over, that journey is still continuing. And occasionally one comes across resistance because of the very different roles that those who are in central government in particular have, and legislators and the judiciary. So there is tension in this dialogue also. But what is recognized is that quite a lot of progress has been made, but we need to go much further and faster together. Now, of course, we're talking in 2022, and I just want to mention a couple of dates because history is important, because we all draw on the customs, the traditions, the institutions of our ancestors. So I'm sitting in London, and this is an event which is hosted by the Westminster Foundation for Democracy. So I want to remind those who may not know this, but one of the key dates in this whole discussion about access to justice was in 1495. And that was when in England, there was a law which was passed by the UK Parliament, because Parliament at that time in 1495 recognized that equality could not exist without reducing the economic barriers to justice faced by poor litigants. And that was one of the first articulations of the imperative of being equal before the law. And across the European continent after that, there were different regions and cities that began to provide public pro bono services, legal services to indigent litigants. And this was an further expansion of the role which had been played by church courts during the Middle Ages, where they did not charge for court costs. And of course, you fast forward, and then we had a much greater articulation of the imperative of access to justice in seminal documents such as the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the UN Convention on Civil and Political Rights, etc., etc. But the second, of course, the key date is 1972, because in 1972, of course, this year we will soon be celebrating Stockholm Plus 50. And the Conference on the Human Environment hosted by Sweden in 1972 it was the beginning of the establishment of ministries of the environment the world over. And my country, India, was one of the first countries to establish Ministry on the Environment. And the words of Indira Gandhi, the Prime Minister of India at that time, have resonated throughout the decades because she linked the issue of the environment and poverty together. And of course, we fast forward to where we are now, and at Globe for many years, we've been chronicling the rise in legislation for environmental protection. And if you just go back over the last almost 30 years, we estimated that in 1997, which was the landmark COP3, the Kyoto Conference of the Climate Convention, in 1997, there were globally something in excess of 50 pieces of legislation to do with climate change. And climate change as a category didn't exist at the time. So we were really looking at which are relevant pieces of legislation to do with energy, to do with water, to do with wildlife, environmental protection, broadly understood. Fast forward to the most recent compendium, and globally we're in excess of 2,500 pieces of legislation. So this legal architecture has mushroomed, and the rule of thumb is that we see a doubling every 5 years. And of course, post-Paris, you mentioned Paris. Paris, of course, was a seminal moment because after Paris, there was a greater explosion of lawmaking. And we'll see something similar, especially around net zero, both with Paris and with Glasgow. So we have the legal architecture, but I'm somebody who became a campaigner on the environment way, way back in the early 90s. And I remember how significant it was when the Aarhus Convention came into being in the late 90s, 1998, I think it was, because Aarhus brought these three issues together: the access to information, the access to participation, along with the access to justice. So without these three, you can't have environmental democracy. And what we've seen since then, and my colleague from Article 19 will be able to speak to this in a much more authoritative way, of course, we've seen laws in particular on rights to information expand around the world. So something like more than 90% of the world is covered with statutory obligations, legal duties for rights to information. Of course, the big gap there is in the enforcement gap. And so the implementation and the enforcement gap. So what I'd just like to focus on for the last couple of minutes is where the challenges remain. First of all, in the lack of real understanding, I think, within parliaments of the role that they can play in improving access to justice, because we have the legal architecture in place. Of course, we can continue to improve on it. And we're learning every day, every month. But fundamentally, it is about legislators understanding their role in post-legislative scrutiny and review processes. One of the key mechanisms for improving that are environmental committees. And we have seen how specialized committees, when they review, in particular, judgments which are coming out of the courts, which is why this dialogue, this dialectic, and understanding what the courts are coming up with and forcing legislators to review poor, weak, inadequate legislation is extremely important, because that leads to an improvement. Well, ideally, it should lead to an improvement in lawmaking and the statutes which are already there. And we see that very much in the context of air pollution. And I hope also in areas which are still quite underdeveloped, such as marine protection. So that's the first category. We need to improve awareness and the ability of lawmakers to do their jobs. The second key issue is around ensuring that we have access to justice, given that the infrastructure and the capabilities themselves are very weak. So if you look across the world, I mean, I love the work that Client Earth is doing. It's wonderful that they're able to bring the lawsuits that they do, addressing government deficiencies. However, in most countries in the world, courts simply don't have the infrastructure, and litigants are too poor to make those kind of claims themselves. Of course, we all know that there are absolutely heroic efforts. For example, the Leghari case in Pakistan, where a farmer was able to bring a landmark, what then became a landmark case before the Punjab bench, before Justice Mansoor Ali Shah. And that was a seminal piece in climate litigation in 2015. Those are extraordinarily rare pieces of justice. By and large, we see decrepit court systems, indigent people who have no real access to justice. They may have information, but how can they then move the courts, and how can they engage with legislators? Those are two very, very significant challenges. The other aspect, of course, is that we are still not through the pandemic. And as you will know, of course, there was a global shutdown, but people don't realize that many parliaments shut down also. And we are all learning to work in this new virtual world. And yet courts are only more recently coming back on track. Courts have been closed in many parts of the world. So justice has also been on hold. So we have a lot of ground to cover, and a lot, arguably, environmental protections to repair, because what's happened in the last couple of years is there has been an acceleration of the, I would say that the efforts by governments to make good on their natural resources by exploiting them, often in the face of violating existing environmental safeguards. So that's a reality. So we are playing catch up right now. So those would be my final thoughts, really. Recognize that while the rhetoric is fantastic around access to justice, the reality of governance systems and legal systems are threadbare, and we have a long way to go to empower people, not just through right to information, but empower them through capacity to engage in their access for justice. So I'll end on that note. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share those thoughts with you.
Now, thank you very much. I think the point was made really clear. And I think it was a very good transition, from all the three speakers. We do have the architecture, we do have the environmental rule of law, but somehow we are not making the most of the different stakeholders that need to work together, to make this work. And we don't necessarily have the enabling conditions to make it work, and the enabling conditions for the people to make it, a process also for the people, because of the gaps in terms of access. So I think, the points were well taken, and it's good to hear now Mrs. Anaïs Berthier, who is the head of EU affairs at, Client Earth. You've been, again, in Client Earth since 2008, as an environmental justice lawyer. You led many litigation cases. And I think what we would like, to hear from you is again, it's a very good transitions from Manini to really understand the role of legislation, of litigation, more specifically in advancing democracy. We know that the cases have bloomed. There's been an increase. We hear this, but as mentioned, from whom? From, and what needs to be done more, to make it a more powerful, pressure point, to get to where we need. And in the EU, we have heard of the Green, deal, same in the US. They're supposed to go into implementation mode, and we still see some contradictory decisions being made, to tackle, some security issues when there's actually multiple crises: food, energy, climate, looming. How do we make the most of those litigation cases?
Thank you. Thanks a lot, and thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm really happy to be with you today and to share some of our thoughts and some of our work. So to start, I just would like to also say that environmental legislation has always been a leverage for democracy and providing rights actually to members of the public, and including procedural rights, of course, in addition to protecting the environment in itself. So as it's been said before, environmental democracy also started with the adoption of the Rio Declaration in 1992 and its Principle 10 that eventually led to the adoption of the Aarhus Convention, the flagship international conventions that provides access to information, public participation, and access to justice in environmental matters. And later on, the adoption of the Escazú Agreement, so which is a kind of Aarhus Convention, but for the Caribbean and South American countries. And the adoption of these principles and conventions also stemmed from the conclusion that environment ministries do not suffice. Public authorities do not suffice, and that the citizens and the NGO participation was a precondition for environmental protection. So we need the involvement of civil society, of citizens, of NGOs to ensure environmental protection. And indeed, we see that the bulk of environmental legislation that is adopted at EU level, for example, is really quite significant. I mean, we have many EU environmental legislation. It needs to be improved, of course. There are loopholes, and that's what the European Commission is doing, including under the European Green Deal, with hundreds of legislative initiatives. However, still, one of the main problems we face is the lack of implementation and enforcement of the already existing environmental legislation. And because unfortunately, most of the decision makers and a major part of the industry still see environmental protection and environmental legislation as a burden, as an economic loss, instead of seeing it as an opportunity, and are reluctant to implementing it. So that is why through litigation, NGOs, associations, but also often members of the public and individuals, we substitute ourselves to decision makers, to public authorities, when they don't play their role in enforcing environmental legislation that already exists. And environmental litigation is really about empowerment. It's really about empowering civil society in getting access to information held by public authorities that would prefer to keep it secret, to being able to participate in the adoption of decisions that would be taken behind closed doors, but also, of course, to having access to courts and to ensure that the courts review decisions that are adopted in breach of the law. And ultimately, the aim is, of course, to ensure that decision makers, but also the industry, are accountable. But what's interesting with litigation as well, I think, is that and I agree that we are lucky to be able to bring these cases, because in the EU, most of the time we have the infrastructures in place. However, it's not because we do have the infrastructures that we do have legal standing everywhere. Unfortunately, there are many obstacles to access to justice still at EU level, whether it is about legal standing. We are still fighting to have legal standing in certain countries, including before the EU courts, whether it is about obstacles about the scope of review of certain decisions, that we are not allowed to review certain decisions that we should be allowed to review, or whether it is about the cost. So there remains lots of obstacles for members of the public to be able to bring strategic environmental litigation. But when we can bring strategic litigation, what's interesting is that it's also empowering citizens and associations, because it places us on an equal footing. When we are before the courts, both parties should be on an equal footing. We are both before a judge that is supposed to be neutral, that is supposed to be impartial, and that is going to say the law and to interpret the law and to choose the interpretation of the law that he is most convinced by. And so that's really important. And that's why also the role of the judge is so important for us, because it's a third parties that we can resort to. And of course, there is the principle of the equality of arms between the parties that are before the court, which is also a source of empowerment. What is important to understand as well is that it's really important that the right access to justice right exists in the legislation, because often the fact that the right exists will act as a deterrent for decision makers and the industry not to violate the legislation. Of course, if the right does not exist, decision makers will feel way more comfortable to breach legislation, unfortunately. And on the second question, I think you wanted me to mention some of our successes, concretely, examples. And so, well, I'd say we have two types of cases. We have the first type of cases that is exactly to advance democracy, advance access to information, public participation, and access to justice in itself. So I'll mention in the little time that I have one case, which was our case against the European Union. And it was a 10-year battle to improve access before the European courts, the Court of Justice of the EU, since, as you may know, no individuals or no NGOs ever have access or legal standing before the Court of Justice of the EU to challenge an act of a European institution, except in access to documents cases, at least under the treaty. It's only under the ARIS regulation that we could challenge certain decisions, but in a really limited way. So we could only challenge a limited category of acts adopted by European institutions. And so we challenged the European Union, represented by the European Commission, before the ARIS Convention Compliance Committee, 10 years after the EU was found in violation of the ARIS Convention and its access to justice provisions for not granting members of the public access before the court. And after a few additional years of advocacy work, we succeeded in convincing the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the Council of the EU to revise the ARIS regulation that applies the convention to the European institutions and to broaden the type of acts adopted by European institutions that can be challenged by NGOs. So now we can challenge all non-legislative acts through an administrative process and then before the court. And also individuals have been granted the right to challenge these decisions as well, even if it's true under really, really restrictive conditions. But at least, I mean, it's already a progress. We also have access to information cases, but that I don't have the time to mention. And on the second type of success in relation to having environmental outcomes, I'll mention one case against the approval and a permit that should have been granted in Poland to a huge coal mine that would have led to 3,000 people homeless. It was an open cast mine of lignite, the dirtiest form of coal, and it would have resulted in the displacement of 7 billion tons of rock, putting the surrounding area at major risk of tremors, as well as serious water and air pollution. It would also have resulted in the displacement and destruction of 33 villages, farms, homes, schools, chapels, and fire stations, and would have resulted in the release of really toxic chemicals and in the air. We challenged the permit and we won. So just a type of example that the litigation work that we do. And as a conclusion, just wanted to say that we are seeing that this movement of the environmental strategic litigation, not only climate litigation, but that is being more and more globalized and more coordinated. And that's a good thing, because some cases are being replicated before other jurisdictions. We've seen it with the Agenda case in the Netherlands, that has been replicated in Ireland and to some extent in France as well. So that's a really good thing. And finally, just stressing the point that unfortunately, access to justice rights, I mean, it's not a given. We still need to fight, including in the EU, to ensure that members of the public have access to courts and have access to legal remedies to challenge decisions of decision makers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anais. I think you would see that I cannot give justice to, all the experience, that is in the room. And it's going to be very difficult to give justice to everything that has been said, but it's good to know what success could look like and how to replicate it. And, based on the gaps and the challenges that you highlighted. But it strikes me that many, and I insist about, these lessons, sharing, and it's because a lot of us, including, I've been in the climate negotiations. I know that you have been advising ministers as well, but, I've been in some, we don't know those stories. And it seems that there's only one side that seems to be, taking advantage. So how to, and I think this is a very good segue to Mrs. Quinn McHugh, who is the executive director, of Article 19. And before, you've been a senior director of many campaigns, a research fellow. You're a trustee at the Equal Rights Trust in the UK. I think what we want to discuss right now, before handing over to a small Q&A session, is that link with the freedom of expression and participation in sustainable, for sustainable development, and also how journalists, how to actually, we can have the data, things are happening, but how journalists can do a better job eventually to exposure and to amplify some of the work that is being done, that still need to be done, so that we fill those gaps. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Amita, and to the Westminster Foundation for Democracy for explicitly bringing freedom of expression to the table. Oftentimes it's seen as complementary but not essential. And I think this is part of the challenge that we all have to face, which is the first thing that we have to realize is that silence equals violence. And it's this nexus of silence and violence that erodes democracy and undercuts the ability to truly achieve sustainable development. One of the previous panelists mentioned, I think it was Malini, that we need to break down the silos between the environmental world and the democracy promotion world. We also need to break down the silos between the world that looks at protection of human rights defenders and environmental activists, because there are so many connections between the two that if not, we're not protecting them holistically, we're fundamentally undermining our ability to truly achieve the environmental and climate justice that we're all working for. Silence can take many forms. It can be the silencing of environmental or land defenders, often indigenous, through murder, physical and legal attacks that are predominantly conducted with impunity. It's silencing of journalists, as we've mentioned, who seek to bring the stories of corruption and environmental degradation and the attacks on these defenders to light. Journalists often silenced through their own killing and legal intimidation, which create dead zones of information at a time when we need it more than ever. There's official silence about the very existence of these attacks. Oftentimes they're not even kept in records in different countries, and it's very impossible many occasions to know the true extent that's actually happening on the ground. And another form of silence is the official silence about the very existence of resource extraction or development projects, as corporations and governments often make scant information about them available to communities they will impact, thus reducing required and oftentimes required public participation. As been noted by colleagues on the panel, this is in the face of a very robust legal structure that looks to protect rights, particularly the rights to expression information. These are set out in Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Article 19 of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, as well as regional treaty bodies and national legislation. As Malini said, over 90% of the countries in the world have some form of access to information law or policy. And 96 countries actually enshrine access to information in their constitutions. We also have, as was mentioned, the Aarhus and Escazú Conventions, on access to environmental information in Europe and Latin America, respectively. Nonetheless, we have physical attacks, arbitrary and disproportionate enforcements of defamation laws, terrorism and national security laws used to silence journalists and environmental rights defenders, as well as judicial intimidation and obstruction of these rights to information and expression. At the start of our session, it was mentioned the impacts specifically on environmental defenders. The Global Witness Report for 2021 revealed that over 227 land and environmental activists were murdered in 2020 for defending their land and the planet. That constitutes the highest number ever recorded for the second consecutive year. And this is in the background of increased focus on the needs to protect the climate and the environment in the face of a pretty significant impending cliff that we're racing towards. Article 19 and numerous other organizations have also documented sustained and ongoing violations of the rights to freedom of expression, as well as assembly globally. Our latest global expression reports documented that freedom of expression was at its lowest point in 20 years. So freedom of thought and expression is being restricted through violence against individuals and through larger public restrictions on information. Individual environmental human rights defenders are particularly at risk, facing intimidation, harassment, arrest, disappearances, torture, and killings. The larger public also suffers from these violations because they too experience the consequences of barriers on free speech and the right to information and to take part in public affairs. For example, when Article 19 worked on projects in Brazil looking at providing access to information on large-scale development projects, we discovered systematic problems with access to official information and public participation. By law, the government was required to make these plans for projects publicly accessible and to hold meaningful consultations. But we found that in many cases, plans were only available in one office that was considerably remote from the communities impacted, in some cases by hundreds of miles. Additionally, the documents were only available in Portuguese and not in any of the local languages, making it extremely difficult for people, particularly Indigenous people, to understand and engage on these issues, not to mention a clear lack of holding publicly accessible meetings in many circumstances. Access to information and freedom of expression are absolutely essential for progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. We need accurate and reliable information from projects on the ground. We need to hear the voices of those impacted and learn how to improve the situation. And we need to understand the extent of violations of rights if we're truly to stop them and build a better world. A lot of the conversation today has been talking about the judicial mechanisms in which this can take place. We've also heard that implementation of these mechanisms can be problematic. This is one of the things that we need to really focus on. So what can be done? To start with, the United Nations can ensure that commitments and actions made at COP26 to implement the Paris Agreement truly integrate human rights protections within it. Governments must ensure that national policies protect land and environmental defenders and to scrap any legislation that is being used to criminalize them. They must also ensure access to justice by investigating and pursuing prosecution of all relevant actors, including implicated corporate actors for violence committed against land and environmental defenders. Governments must also ensure that all stakeholders are able to take an effective part in environmental impact assessments and consultations, and in the decision-making on these projects. This should include holding public hearings on environmental projects and providing sufficient advance notice of information on the projects and in public meetings. And then finally, governments must ensure Indigenous peoples are not impaired in the exercise of their rights to access their lands and territories, including in regard to environmental projects undertaken or funded by private business. I mentioned at the beginning there's a particular impact that can be had in terms of the silencing of journalists and the media who are active on environmental reporting in countries. And one of the questions that's been posed is, what is the role of rule of law have in terms of the impact on journalists who are doing environmental reporting? Well, when Article 19 and other press freedom organizations analyze annually what issues that journalists who are murdered were reporting on, environmental and land issues are always near the top, depending on the year, sometimes up and sometimes down. Because these issues often overlap with reporting on corruption or the misuse of official funds. It's extremely dangerous to report on these issues, made even more so in countries with a weaker rule of law. Nearly all of the killings of journalists documented in 2021 occurred in countries with a weaker rule of law, as established by the Rule of Law Index by the World Justice Project. The same is true of the killings of environmental defenders, with extractive industries particularly active in these predominantly Global South countries. Thus, the deck is already stacked against journalists who want to report on environmental issues. The problem is exquisitely exacerbated by impunity. There is a near total lack of accountability for the murder and attacks on journalists worldwide, considerably lowering the costs of doing so for bad actors. If you know you can get away with it and someone's being a thorn in your side, why wouldn't you do it? For example, the Global Witness reported that 20 environmental defenders were killed in Mexico in 2020. Separately, at least 5 journalists were also killed in 2020 in Mexico, making it one of the most deadlies in the country in the world for each, both for environmental defenders and for journalists. In terms of the rule of law, Mexico ranks 113 out of 139 in the Rule of Law Index, showing the nexus of these issues. But it's not just killings that expose the weakness of the justice system. Governments and corporations often use lawsuits to attack journalists reporting on these issues. For example, charging them frequently with criminal defamation in countries where it is a criminal offense, for raising questions about corporations or members of the government and their relation with environmental projects, particularly extractive projects. A particularly egregious example came from India. In 2018, an Indian minister claimed a pair of quote-unquote French spies had infiltrated India by sea to commit, quote, treasonous conspiracy. In reality, they were 2 visiting journalists, and their mission was to investigate allegations of illegal sand mining in the southern state of Tamil Nadu. Now, the fallout from this visit was significant for the journalists and for others. It included a police investigation, a politically fueled propaganda campaign, and the arrest of 2 local translators who'd been working for the journalists. A local Indian environmental journalist described her situation separate from this one. Her probing into the sand mining had resulted in stalking and various types of harassment, including rape threats, vandalism, the hiring of detective agencies to tail her, and government documents showing that officials had actually colluded to slander her. But I should be very clear, this is not just a problem in countries with a weaker rule of law. In the United States, journalist Amy Goodman was arrested for rioting by the local police after she released footage of tear gas and dogs being used against Native Americans who were protesting the siting of an oil pipeline on their land. While the charges were ultimately dropped by a judge, she's not the only journalist to have faced aggressive policing at environmental protests and subsequent charge. And in Britain, police have been repeatedly accused of violence against reporters who cover environmental protests in the country. The newly proposed policing and crime bill seems to be written specifically with an eye towards making environmental protests impossible and putting at risk those who would cover those protests. The Policing, Crime, Sentencing, and Courts bill would grant police powers to restrict protest when they are deemed to, quote, threaten public order or to stop people from getting on with their daily lives. The proposed legislation represents a dangerous threat to essential democratic and civil liberties, such as the right to protest. And you can see how this legislation could be replicated and misused in dangerous places around the world.
I think
as a result, you have a near total opposition from environmental and groups in the UK.
Thank you very much, Queen. I think, the picture is absolutely clear. And I think the point, of protection and empowerment throughout, all those presentation is there. There's a lot of work to do. I think there's, good cases, we're making progress, but we're not nearly where we need to be. And I think you highlighted all the contradictions, right? With your examples, including where we would and when we would expect them the least. I think, Malini and Arnold, there's two questions, that were raised in the chat. I don't know if you've seen them. Maybe you can, respond to them in 1 minute each before we conclude. We don't have a lot of time, unfortunately, before I wrap up and take time but over to you, Arnold, and then Malini, very quickly for our respondents. And thank you again, Queen, for that.
Thank you, Amida, and a really great panel. I enjoyed listening to all the panelists. Anna, thank you very much for the question, and great to see you as part of this panel. Ana Barrera, of course, herself is a very well experienced lawyer. You're in response to your question. There is never a single answer when it comes to multilateral negotiation processes, and I think you specifically refer to the UNEP 50 political declaration. For those who don't know, in February, just this past February, we had the second session of the UN Environment Assembly, which is a universal body, a deliberative body on environmental issues, and then a special session to commemorate the 50th anniversary of UNEP. There is never, as I said, a single answer, but what I think it points to, Anna, is this disconnect that I've pointed to also in my remarks of developments at the national and regional level. We heard from Malini, we heard from Quinn, we heard from Anais, and also Justice Benjamin, the great number of pieces at the national level that recognize environmental rights, and also at the regional level, Aarhus, Escazú. There is, as I said in my remarks, much more work to be done to globalize these rights. But at the same time, I would like to highlight that the political declaration does take note of the Human Rights Council resolution and points to the fact that the General Assembly has been asked to consider this matter. It also recognizes, of course, all the principles of the Rio Declaration, including what we're talking about here. It recognizes and actually encourages greater investments into environmental rule of law and the work that UNEP and other stakeholders do to help legal stakeholders, make sense of environmental rights and environmental legislation on the ground, whereas we have just heard from Quinn, it perhaps matters most. So I think there are many, many positives in terms of where governments have left off in February. But of course, Anna, you're right. There is much more that needs to be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arnold. And over to you, Malini.
Thanks, Yamida, and thank you very much for the question. Let me just answer both of those very quickly on the example of countries where it's not easy to file environmental cases. So of course, there are many green tribunals and specialized environmental courts, in particular across Asia. But I would say that countries where it's more challenging to bring lawsuits for environmental crime allegations include countries such as Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Mali, Myanmar, Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea. I could go on. And you'll see that there is a particularly strong congruence between those countries which present challenges for environmental defenders and advocates and democratic governance. So we need environmental democracy and democratic governance. The two cannot exist without the other. Secondly, in terms of the question about, or it was a comment really about the very interesting rulings across the Latin American Caribbean region. Indeed, that's very true, but there's also some very interesting lawmaking there. And I'm thinking in particular of Ecuador, which is one of the few countries which grants legal personhood to nature in its constitution. And of course, we have countries such as Mexico, Bolivia and Colombia, which again grants nature legal personhood. And then you have countries such as Bangladesh and Australia and others, which grant legal personhood to rivers. So increasingly, we are seeing nature also acquire greater legal definition. But I would be remiss if I did not mention also the attempts to have an ecocide treaty, which could be a game changer. The advocates very much make the claim that having ecocide as up there along with crimes against humanity, that you could be prosecuted, governments could be prosecuted for crimes against humanity, could change the very nature of governments' viewing of this as something that they can get away with. So hopefully those are two useful points of information, but I just want to take the opportunity of thanking everybody, in particular those who are working as environmental defenders, for the work that you're doing at times of growing political repression. So thank you very much to the organizers and all of you and your questions.
Thank you, Malini, again. Thank you, everyone. I've got, I hope I can stay just a couple of minutes to say a proper thank you. Indeed, Malini, let's acclaim the unsung heroes, these environmental defenders. Let me thank you for the time that you spent. I think it was a rich, a very rich sessions. Please do see the bios, see how much you can leverage, from those who were, part of this panel. And a huge thank you for the Westminster Foundation for Democracy, but also the World Resource Institute, and other co-organizers, for making this happen. The fight continues. There's more to come after this session, but I think the conversation that we had, particularly today, cannot stay where it is. I think we know the challenges, we know the trend. It's all about breaking silences, the different form of silences. It's all about empowerment to make the most of a holistic approach, because we do have some structures. We do have environmental, rule of laws, but somehow what will make a difference is our ability to implement, to enforce, and make this a reality, and really fostering still expression and fostering access. And I think as the Open Society Foundation, we take note of this. We know our duty in creating those virtuous cycle of democracy and of justice. Thank you all, and see you on the line and elsewhere, everywhere in the world. Thank you. Bye-bye.